My father didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't need to. The room was already quiet enough to hear the clock over the fireplace ticking like a countdown. "Sign the transfer," he said, calmly sliding the folder across the table. "All $9.8 million. To your sister." I stared at the paper. The names, the numbers, the certainty in his face. "I'm not signing," I said. That's when my mother stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. Her hand came out of nowhere. Smack. "You don't have a choice," she screamed. The lawyer looked straight at her and said, "Ma'am, do you know who really—" My father exploded. "Know what?" Fan 1. The meeting. They thought would break me. The meeting was supposed to be just family. That was the phrase my mother used on the phone 3 days earlier, her voice overly sweet, stretched tight like plastic wrap. Just family. Nothing formal. We all need to be on the same page. Those words alone should have warned me. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway that Sunday afternoon, the street was already crowded with cars. My aunt's Lexus, my uncle's old pickup, 2 sedans I recognized from church, the kind of gathering that didn't happen unless something important or ugly was about to be announced. Inside the house smelled like lemon cleaner and roast chicken. The good dishes were out. Folding chairs lined the walls of the living room facing the long oak table like an audience waiting for a verdict. I counted quickly. 23 people, maybe more. Enough witnesses to make sure no one could later claim they'd misunderstood. My sister Karen sat near the center legs, crossed hands, folded neatly in her lap. She wore cream-colored slacks and a soft blue blouse, the kind of outfit that said reasonable and responsible. Her husband sat beside her, one hand resting possessively on the back of her chair. She smiled when she saw me, the same tight smile she'd worn our whole lives. Polite, careful, victorious. I took a seat near the end of the table, close to the wall. Old habit. I'd learned young how to stay out of the center of things. My father stood at the head of the table, straight-backed, commanding the way he always looked when he believed he was doing the right thing. Beside him was a man I recognized immediately, Mr. Caldwell, the family lawyer. Gray hair, clean suit, leather briefcase resting at his feet like punctuation. That was when I knew this wasn't just family. My mother hovered near the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, eyes already sharp with anticipation. She didn't sit, she paced. She always paced when she thought control might slip. "Thank you all for coming," my father began. His voice filled the room without effort. "This won't take long." Karen glanced around, nodding as if she were the one hosting. A few relatives murmured approvingly. Someone chuckled. I noticed how easily they all leaned toward her, how natural it looked. My father slid a thick folder across the table toward me. It stopped just short of my hands. "We've been reviewing the family assets," he said. "After a lot of thought, your mother and I have decided it's best to simplify things." I opened the folder slowly. Not because I was confused, but because I already knew what I'd find. Property valuations, investment summaries, trust language. The number sat bold and unapologetic on the first page. $9,800,000. My name was already printed on the signature line, blank, waiting. "Sign the transfer," my father said, finally looking directly at me. "All of it, to your sister." A ripple moved through the room. Not surprise, relief. This was the ending they'd rehearsed. I felt my pulse steady instead of spike. Years in uniform will do that to you. When things get loud, you get quiet. "I'm not signing," I said. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. Karen's smile flickered, just for a second. My mother reacted first. She surged forward, chair tipping behind her, her face flushed red with something deeper than anger. Her hand connected with my cheek before I had time to move. The sound was sharp, final. "You don't have a choice," she screamed. "Do you hear me? You don't." The room froze. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered my name. I tasted metal. Not blood, just the shock of it. My cheek burned, but my hands stayed flat on the table. Mr. Caldwell stood slowly adjusting his glasses. His eyes moved from my mother's raised hand to my face, then back to the folder. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "do you know who really—" "Know what?" my father roared, slamming his palm on the table so hard the dishes rattled. "What are you even implying?" Every head turned, every breath held. I looked at my father then. really looked at him, at the certainty etched into his expression, at the confidence of a man who believed the ground beneath him was solid because it always had been. "You really don't know," I said quietly. Confusion spread across the room like a slow leak. My father laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "Don't start this," he said. "You've always had trouble accepting reality." Reality. That word had followed me my whole life, usually as a warning. Be realistic. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Karen needs this more than you. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat again, but my mother cut him off. "She's being selfish," my mother snapped. "She always does this. Makes things difficult, after everything we've done for her." I raised my hand slightly, not to defend myself, to signal patience. "I said I'm not signing," I repeated. "And before anyone says another word, I think you should hear why." Karen leaned forward now, eyes glossy, voice soft. "We're just trying to keep the family together," she said. "You're barely even here anymore. You have your career, your life." There it was, the familiar framing. I had enough, therefore I should give. I closed the folder gently and pushed it back across the table. "You didn't invite me here to talk," I said. "You invited me to comply." The lawyer finally spoke, his voice steady but edged with concern. "Before any documents are signed," he said, "there are some clarifications we need to make." My father rounded on him. "This is straightforward." "It may not be," Mr. Caldwell replied. My mother's eyes darted between us. "What does that mean?" I leaned back in my chair, the sting on my cheek fading into a dull ache. The room felt suddenly smaller, tighter, like the air before a storm. "It means," I said, "that you're asking me to sign away something you don't actually control." The silence that followed was heavy enough to press against my ears. My father stared at me, his jaw tightening. "You're confused." "No," I said. "I'm prepared." Karen shook her head, laughing nervously. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked. I stood slowly, every movement deliberate. "Before we go any further," I continued, "you should all understand how we got here. Because this story didn't start today. And it didn't start with money." I looked around the room at the faces that had watched me grow up and decided long ago what role I was allowed to play. "It started years ago," I said. "When I learned what happens to the child, everyone assumes we'll be fine. Growing up, my family never called it favoritism. They didn't need to. Favoritism was just the shape of our lives, the way furniture sits in the same place long enough that you stop noticing it's there." Karen was 3 years older than me, which in our house translated to something far more permanent than age. She was first. First grandchild, first steps, first smile everyone remembered. By the time I arrived, the family narrative had already been written, and Karen's name was printed in bold at the top. She was the organized one, the dependable one, the child my parents said had leadership qualities before she'd even learned to tie her shoes. I was the other one. Not unwanted, not unloved, just expected to manage. When Karen cried, my mother rushed. When I cried, I was told I was strong. When Karen struggled, my father intervened. When I struggled, I was reminded that I'd always been independent. "You'll be fine," they'd say, over and over again, like a blessing, like a dismissal. At family dinners, Karen sat beside my father, updating him on her plans, her classes, her goals. He listened, nodding, offering advice. When I spoke, conversations paused politely and then drifted back to where they'd been. I learned early that attention was a currency I didn't have. In elementary school, Karen's report cards went on the refrigerator. Mine went into a drawer. In middle school, when she joined student council, my parents rearranged their schedules to attend meetings. When I qualified for an academic competition, my mother smiled and said, "That's nice, honey," before reminding me Karen had practice. It wasn't cruelty. That's what makes it hard to explain to people who didn't grow up like that. There were no slammed doors, no screaming matches, just 1,000 small recalibrations where my needs were adjusted downward to make room for hers. Karen needed a new car for college. I took the bus. Karen changed majors twice. My tuition came with a reminder to be grateful. Karen moved back home after graduation to figure things out. When I stayed home too long after high school, my father asked when I planned to do something real. I joined the military at 22. People assume it was a calling, a dream, some patriotic awakening. It wasn't. It was a way out. The day I signed my enlistment papers, my father shook my hand like I'd accepted a job at a factory across town. Good benefits, he said. Structure. Karen hugged me and whispered I could never do that, like it made her better. Basic training stripped me down to nothing and rebuilt me piece by piece. The yelling didn't bother me. I'd grown up translating tone into survival. What surprised me was how clear everything was. In uniform, effort mattered, precision mattered, documentation mattered. Nobody asked whose daughter I was. Nobody expected me to shrink so someone else could shine. For the first time in my life, being quiet didn't make me invisible. It made me observant. I learned how systems actually worked, how one missing signature could stall an entire operation, how numbers told stories if you paid attention long enough, how rules existed not to control people but to keep chaos from pretending it was order. When I came home on leave, the contrast was jarring. Karen was helping my parents manage things, their investments, their accounts, their paperwork. My father bragged about her to anyone who'd listen. She's got a head for business, he'd say, just like me. No one asked what I did in the military. When they did, they stopped listening halfway through the answer. You don't need to worry about money, my mother once told me over coffee. Karen's taking care of that side of things. That was the first time I noticed the phrase, that side of things. As if finances were a personality trait. As if responsibility could be assigned by birth order. The one person who never spoke that way was my grandmother Eleanor, my father's mother. She lived alone in a modest house with creaky floors and a view of the back alley, not the bay. She watched everything and commented on very little. When I visited her, she asked real questions, not polite ones. What are you learning? She'd ask. What do you notice? What doesn't make sense to you? Once, while sorting through old family files at her kitchen table, she slid a stack of documents toward me. Tell me what you see, she said. I did. Numbers that didn't align, dates that skipped, transactions that looked tidy on the surface and wrong underneath. She nodded once slowly, that's what I thought. She never accused, never explained. She just filed the papers away and said some things are clearer to people who aren't desperate to be admired. I didn't understand then, not fully. But years passed and patterns have a way of sharpening with distance. Karen's lifestyle grew more expensive than her salary could justify. My parents' stories about their assets changed depending on who was listening. Paperwork was always handled. Questions were always unnecessary. And I stayed what I had always been, the backup plan, the one they assumed would adapt. Until the day they asked me to give up $9.8 million like it was an overdue library book. Sitting in that living room, my cheek still warm from my mother's hand, I realized something with startling clarity. They hadn't invited me because they respected me. They'd invited me because they believed I would fold. And that belief that quiet girls always comply was about to cost them everything they thought they controlled. Because while they were busy deciding who deserved what, I had been learning something far more dangerous. I had learned how to read the truth when it was hiding in plain sight. And soon they were going to learn what happens when the child everyone underestimates stops playing the role they assigned her. The first time I realized something was wrong, it didn't arrive like a revelation. There was no dramatic gasp, no moment where the room tilted and everything made sense. It came quietly the way truth usually does through repetition. I was home on a short leave, barely 10 days between assignments, and I'd gone to see my grandmother Eleanor because she'd asked. Not demanded, asked. That alone made it different. Her kitchen smelled like black coffee and lemon soap. Papers were spread across the table in careful stacks weighted down with an old glass paperweight shaped like an apple. She didn't look anxious. She looked resolved. I want your eyes on these, she said, tapping the nearest pile. Not your opinion, your eyes. That was how she always framed things. Observation first, judgment later. I sat down and began where I always did: dates, headings, totals, rental income summaries, investment distributions, maintenance expenses. At a glance, everything looked tidy, too tidy. I flipped a page, then another. The same vendor name appeared 3 times in one quarter. Emergency repairs, all under the same dollar threshold. Each one approved by Karen, each one paid promptly. That roof can't be replaced 3 times in 4 months, I said without looking up. Eleanor nodded but didn't smile. I kept going. A line item labeled miscellaneous administrative costs ballooned year over year. Travel reimbursements tied to site visits that didn't match lease renewal dates. Checks written instead of electronic transfers just often enough to avoid patterns a casual reviewer might notice. It wasn't theft in the movie sense, it was something far more familiar. Assumption. The assumption that no one would look closely. That even if someone did, they wouldn't understand what they were seeing. And if they understood, they wouldn't push back. I exhaled slowly. These accounts aren't structured the way your son says they are. Eleanor folded her hands. No, she said. They aren't. She reached for a folder I hadn't opened yet. This one was heavier, thicker paper, crisp edges. Inside were trust documents. Not drafts, executed copies. A revocable trust established years earlier, assets listed meticulously, properties, accounts, contingencies, and one clause that made my breath catch just slightly. Successor authority. My name? Not beneficiary, not recipient. Authority. I looked up at her. When did you do this? When I realized she said calmly that love doesn't stop people from making selfish decisions. It just makes them better at justifying them. I wanted to argue, to soften it, to suggest there had been misunderstandings. But the numbers didn't lie, and neither did the documents. I didn't want conflict, she continued. I wanted continuity, someone who would protect what exists, not drain it for validation. She paused, studying my face. You know how to do that? I swallowed. Karen won't take this well. Eleanor's mouth twitched. Karen has always taken well to applause. This isn't that. She didn't ask me to promise anything. She didn't need to. Instead, she closed the folder and slid it toward me. Keep copies, she said, and keep quiet. I did both. Over the next year, I paid attention in a way I never had before. Not because I was looking for betrayal, but because I finally understood the language being spoken around me. When my father boasted about the family portfolio, he always spoke in estimates, rounded numbers, convenient totals. When Karen talked about managing assets, she focused on outcomes, not processes. Growth, expansion, lifestyle. No one mentioned governance, oversight, safeguards. Except Eleanor and me. When Eleanor passed 18 months later, the grief hit me sideways. She had been the one place in my family where I didn't have to translate myself. Losing her felt like losing gravity. The funeral was dignified, controlled. Everyone praised her foresight, her generosity, her devotion to family. The morning after, my mother called. We should talk about the assets, she said gently. Not about Eleanor, about the assets. I declined, politely, firmly. 3 weeks later, the first message came from Karen. We need to simplify things. This doesn't have to be hard. Dad's getting older. Each text carried the same subtext I'd grown up with: step aside. I didn't respond. Instead, I met with an independent attorney, not to challenge anything, to confirm it. He reviewed the trust, the filings, the recorded instruments. It's solid, he said, and very intentionally structured. Who can change it, I asked. No one, he replied, not without your cooperation. That was the moment the weight of it settled into my chest, not triumph, not fear, but responsibility. I wasn't holding money. I was holding a boundary someone else had built and trusted me to enforce. The family meeting invitation arrived 2 weeks later, wrapped in politeness and pressure. We just need clarity, for peace, for family. By then, I understood something they didn't. They believed they were negotiating. They didn't realize the negotiation had already ended years ago with signatures they'd never bothered to read. Sitting in that living room, my mother's anger still vibrating in the air, my father demanding answers he wasn't prepared to hear, I felt strangely calm. Because I finally knew what the numbers were saying. And I knew exactly when to let them speak. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It never does. It seeps in slowly, disguised as concern, wrapped in language that sounds like care if you don't listen closely. After Eleanor's funeral, my parents suddenly wanted to talk more. Not about grief, about logistics, about responsibility, about how complex things had become. My mother called twice in 1 week, leaving voicemails that all started the same way. We're just worried about you. Then came the pivot. Karen has been carrying so much. Then the conclusion. You wouldn't want to make this harder than it already is. Karen texted from a new number as if distance might soften the ask. Dad's health isn't what it used to be. This is about stability. You don't even live here anymore. I read each message once, then I archived them. The invitation to the family meeting came by email. Subject line family discussion, Sunday. No details, no agenda, just a time and my parents' address. I almost didn't go. Not because I was afraid, but because part of me already knew how it would unfold. I could hear the arguments before they were spoken, see the expressions on their faces, feel the weight of being outnumbered in a room designed to make dissent feel rude. But avoidance would have confirmed their assumptions. So I went. The morning of the meeting, I pressed my uniform carefully, even though I knew I wouldn't wear it. Old instincts die hard. Order before confrontation, preparation before impact. I chose neutral clothes. Nothing that looked defensive, nothing that looked defiant. When I arrived, my mother hugged me too tightly, her arms stiff. "We're glad you're here," she said, already steering me toward the living room. The house had been rearranged, furniture pushed back, chairs added, like a tribunal disguised as a gathering. Karen was already there talking animatedly with my uncle. She glanced up when she saw me and offered a soft, rehearsed smile. "I'm really glad you came," she said. "This doesn't have to be uncomfortable." That was the line she always used right before things became exactly that. My father waited until everyone had settled before speaking. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask if I'd driven far. He went straight to the point. "We need clarity," he said, folding his hands on the table. "We can't keep operating in uncertainty." Karen nodded. "It's not fair to anyone." I noticed how quickly she said that. Anyone, not everyone. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat, opening his briefcase. "We've prepared a straightforward transfer," he said. "It's meant to consolidate assets under one managing party." "And that party is Karen," my mother added, sharp and immediate, "because she's here, she's invested, she's been doing the work." I waited. My father slid the folder toward me, the same one he'd later push across the table again, expecting compliance. "Sign this," he said, "and we can all move forward." I looked at the paper, then at him. "No," I said. The room reacted like I'd spoken another language. My mother stood abruptly. "Excuse me." "I'm not signing," I repeated. "Not today, not ever." Karen sighed, shaking her head. "Why are you doing this?" "That's my question," I replied. My father leaned forward. "This isn't about you," he said. "You're being emotional." I almost laughed. Emotion was the one thing I wasn't bringing into the room. "This is about the family," my mother insisted. "And sometimes that means making sacrifices." I met her gaze. "I've been making sacrifices my whole life." Her hand came out of nowhere. The sound echoed louder than it should have, sharp, final. "You don't have a choice," she screamed. "Do you hear me? You don't." Someone gasped. Someone else stood halfway up, unsure whether to intervene. I didn't move. Mr. Caldwell rose from his chair, concern etched across his face. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "before this goes any further, there are some things you should understand." My father slammed his palm on the table. "No," he snapped. "This ends now." Mr. Caldwell hesitated, then looked at me. I gave him the smallest nod. He turned back to my mother. "Do you know who really holds authority over these assets?" My father exploded. "Know what?" he shouted. "Stop speaking in riddles." The room went silent. I felt the familiar pull to soften things, to explain, to make it easier for everyone else. The reflex of the child who kept the peace. I ignored it. "You're asking me to sign away something you don't control," I said evenly. "And you're doing it in front of witnesses because you think pressure will work." Karen's face flushed. "You're twisting this." "No," I said. "I'm naming it." My father stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. "You think you're smarter than us?" "I think you never thought you needed to be careful," I replied. Mr. Caldwell closed the folder slowly. "We need to pause," he said. "There are legal realities here that—" "We'll handle our family matters ourselves," my mother snapped. I stood then, not to leave, but to change the balance of the room. "If you want to understand what's actually happening, I said you should listen to your lawyer." My father's voice dropped, dangerous and controlled. "And if we don't? Then you'll keep making decisions based on assumptions," I answered. "And assumptions don't hold up very well when paperwork gets involved." No one spoke. I looked around the room at the faces that had watched me grow up, that had agreed without question that Karen should lead and I should yield. "I didn't come here to fight," I said. "I came here because you invited me. But I won't be cornered." I picked up my bag, resting it at my feet. "If you want to continue," I added, "we can. But it's going to be honest." That was when I saw it in my father's eyes. Not anger. Fear. Because for the first time he understood something fundamental had shifted. And he had no idea how far ahead I already was. Silence has weight when enough people are holding their breath. It presses against your ears, your chest, the space between words. The living room felt smaller then, like the walls had leaned in to listen. My father broke it first. "If you're not signing," he said slowly, "then tell us what you think you know." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached down and pulled my bag onto the table. It wasn't dramatic. No slam. Just the soft thud of canvas against oak. I unzipped it carefully and removed a slim, fireproof folder, charcoal gray with a metal clasp. Click. The sound cut through the room sharper than my mother's slap had. Karen leaned back in her chair. "What is this?" she asked, trying to sound amused. "Are you serious right now?" Mr. Caldwell's eyes fixed on the folder. He didn't speak, but something in his posture changed. Lawyers know that sound. The sound of preparation. "I didn't bring opinions," I said. "I brought records." I opened the folder and slid the first document onto the table. I didn't announce it. I let the paper speak for itself. Mr. Caldwell leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He read silently at first, lips moving just slightly, then his brow furrowed. "This is a recorded trust," he said slowly. My father scoffed. "We already have a trust." Mr. Caldwell didn't look up. "Not like this." I placed the second document down, then the third, each one aligned, carefully, edges squared like I'd been trained to do. Karen's smile vanished. "You're embarrassing yourself," she said. "You don't even understand." "Karen," Mr. Caldwell interrupted quietly, "please stop talking." That alone stunned the room. He picked up the top document, checking the county seal, the recording number, the date. Then he flipped to the signature page. My name. Not on the line they'd asked me to sign today. Already there. My mother's voice shook. That doesn't mean anything. Eleanor was old. She didn't know. She knew exactly what she was doing, Mr. Caldwell said, sharper now. This was executed years ago, properly, with witnesses, with independent counsel. My father stood so fast his chair toppled backward. "No," he said, "that's not possible." I slid one more page forward. "This one explains it." It was a designation of authority, clear, unambiguous. Karen lunged forward, grabbing for the papers. "This is fake." Mr. Caldwell caught her wrist midair. "Do not touch that." She froze. He turned to my parents. "Do you know who really holds decision-making authority over these assets?" He asked again, his voice calm but final. My mother opened her mouth. No sound came out. My father's face drained of color. "We're the parents," he said weakly. "They're family assets." Mr. Caldwell shook his head. "They are not." He looked at me then, not as their daughter but as his client. "You are the acting authority. You always have been." The room erupted. My aunt whispered, "Oh my God." Someone else muttered, "That changes everything." Karen's husband stood backing away as if the floor had cracked beneath his feet. "Karen," he said quietly, "you said this was settled." My mother pressed her hands to her mouth, eyes wide. "You planned this," she whispered at me, "behind our backs." "No," I said, "you ignored it." My father rounded on me, rage flickering behind his eyes. "You let us plan this meeting," he accused. "You let us invite people." "Yes," I said evenly, "because I was told I didn't have a choice." Karen's voice broke. "You did this to hurt me." I finally looked at her fully. "No," I said. "I did this to stop you." The truth settled slowly, unevenly, not like a bomb, like a fog lifting. Mr. Caldwell gathered the documents into a neat stack. "There is nothing to transfer," he announced to the room. "The assets are already placed. There is no legal mechanism for what you're asking." My father sank back into his chair, hands shaking. "All this time," he whispered. "All this time we thought." "You assumed," I said softly. Karen shook her head, tears streaking down her face now. "This isn't fair." I met her gaze. Neither was being told my whole life that I didn't matter. My mother looked at me, then really looked. Not as a problem, not as an obstacle, as something she didn't recognize. "We raised you," she said. "You owe us." I closed the folder and clasped it shut. Click. "I don't owe you my silence," I replied. No one argued after that. There was nothing left to argue about. The truth had taken the floor and it wasn't yielding. I picked up my bag slowly. "This meeting is over," I said, "and so is the assumption that I will always step aside." As I turned toward the door, I felt something unexpected, not triumph, not relief, but a quiet certainty. For the first time in my life, the paper had spoken louder than anyone in that room. And everyone had heard it. Consequences rarely arrive with drama. They don't slam doors or shout accusations. They move quietly, methodically, like paperwork processed in the background, while people are still arguing about feelings. I left my parents' house before anyone thought to stop me. The sun was already lowering, casting long shadows across the driveway. I paused for just a moment beside my car, listening to the muffled sound of voices inside, confused, overlapping, stripped of the certainty they'd walked in with. Then I got in, closed the door, and drove away. I didn't feel victorious, I felt tired. That night I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. No replaying conversations, no rehearsing defenses, just the steady quiet that comes when a decision is no longer theoretical. The fallout began the next morning. Mr. Caldwell called first. His tone was professional but different now, careful, respectful. "There will be adjustments," he said. "Some things your parents believed were in motion simply aren't." I thanked him and ended the call. By noon, Karen had called 6 times. I didn't answer. By evening, the family group chat exploded. "How could you do this to us?" Mom hasn't stopped crying. "You embarrassed Dad in front of everyone. This isn't what Grandma would have wanted." I read every message once, then muted the thread. Instead, I opened my laptop and did what I'd been trained to do. I reviewed. I verified. I documented. Within 48 hours, I'd engaged an independent management firm to oversee the assets. Not friends, not family, professionals with no emotional investment and a paper trail for everything they touched. Tenants were notified. Maintenance schedules were standardized. Financial accounts were locked down with dual authentication and oversight protocols that made quiet skimming impossible. No speeches, no press releases, just structure. Karen's lifestyle began unraveling almost immediately. Credit cards flagged, accounts frozen pending review, a temporary hold placed on discretionary spending she'd come to rely on. Her husband moved out within a week, citing misrepresentation with the flat tone of someone who'd discovered the foundation of his life was built on borrowed confidence. My parents sold the lake house quietly, then the second car, then my mother's jewelry collection piece by piece at an estate broker she'd once looked down on. They moved into a smaller place near the highway, not poor, not ruined, just reduced. I heard all of this secondhand. I didn't call, I didn't gloat, I didn't explain. Because consequences don't need narration. 2 weeks after the meeting, an envelope arrived at my apartment. My mother's handwriting, careful, controlled. Inside was a single page. "We need to talk." No apology, no accusation, just the first honest sentence she'd offered in years. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I kept building the life I'd paused to survive the confrontation. Morning runs, work deadlines, grocery lists, normal things. The kind of normal no one had ever expected me to prioritize. When Karen finally cornered me outside my building, she looked smaller, thinner, less certain. "You ruined everything," she said, voice hoarse. I met her eyes. "No," I replied. "You just never planned for accountability." She laughed bitterly. "You always think you're better than us." I shook my head. "I think I'm done being quieter so you can be louder." She walked away without another word. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of boundaries. A month passed. Then another. Life stabilized. The assets were no longer symbols. They were responsibilities. Ones I carried with intention and distance. And then one evening my father called. Not my mother, not a group text, just him. "I'd like to meet," he said, his voice unfamiliar. Lower, less certain, if you're willing. I considered it longer than I expected. Then I said yes. Not because I owed him closure, but because I was curious what a man sounds like when his authority finally stops working. We met at a diner my father used to take us to when we were kids. Vinyl booths, a counter worn smooth by decades of elbows, coffee that tasted burnt no matter how much cream you added. It was the kind of place where time didn't move forward so much as it settled. He was already there when I arrived, sitting with his hands folded around a mug he hadn't touched. For a moment I almost didn't recognize him. Not because he looked older, though he did, but because something essential was missing. The certainty. The assumption that the world would arrange itself around his decisions. He stood when he saw me, hesitated, then sat back down. "Thank you for coming," he said. I slid into the booth across from him and nodded. "You said you wanted to talk." The waitress appeared, poured coffee without asking, and disappeared again. We sat in the silence she left behind. "I was wrong," my father said. No preamble, no qualifiers, just 3 words spoken like they'd been sitting on his tongue for weeks. I didn't respond right away. I waited. In my experience, people often rush to fill the quiet when they're uncomfortable. I wanted to hear what he'd say when no one rescued him from it. I thought he continued slowly that keeping the family together meant deciding what was best for everyone. I thought authority was the same thing as responsibility. He looked down at his hands. I see now that it isn't. Something loosened in my chest, not forgiveness exactly, but relief, the kind that comes when a truth finally gets spoken aloud. "You didn't ask," I said. "You decided." He nodded. I did. Another pause, this one heavier. "I should have protected you," he said quietly. "Instead, I treated your silence like consent." That landed harder than I expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was accurate. I learned to be quiet because it kept the peace, I said. Not because I agreed. "I know," he replied. "I see that now." We talked for nearly an hour. Not about money, not about documents, about childhood, about expectations that calcify into roles, about how easy it is to reward the child who reflects your own image and overlook the one who challenges it simply by being different. He didn't ask for the assets back. He didn't ask me to soften anything. He didn't ask me to fix what had broken. That mattered. When we stood to leave, he placed a tentative hand on my shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I should have said that a long time ago." I nodded once, "Thank you." Outside, the air was cool and clean. Traffic moved steadily down the road, indifferent to family reckonings and long overdue admissions. Life didn't magically resolve after that. My mother took longer. Karen longer still. Some relationships remained distant, polite, redefined. But something fundamental had changed. I no longer explained myself. I no longer preemptively shrank. The assets stabilized. Tenants felt secure. Systems worked the way they were supposed to. Not because someone was watching closely, but because accountability had been built into the structure. And I built a life that felt like my own, one that didn't require permission. Sometimes late at night I think about the version of myself who sat quietly at that oak table, cheek burning, being told she had no choice. I think about how many people are asked to sign away pieces of themselves in the name of harmony. How often love gets used as leverage. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her this. You always had a choice. You just didn't have proof yet. To anyone listening who has ever been pressured to comply, to stay quiet, to give up what matters, because it makes someone else more comfortable, your boundaries are not betrayal. Your clarity is not cruelty. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let the truth speak for itself. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're listening from. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about boundaries, courage, and reclaiming your voice, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening.